Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Great, thank you all. I wanted to sort of also touch on the issue of, many of the things that our society undergoes, and we're currently experiencing the opioid epidemic, which I'm sure you're all aware of, is sort of the delicate balance between whether drugs are used medicinally, therapeutically, in a prescription basis, and whether they're used recreationally. And so we know opioids are obviously used as a painkiller, but people develop problematic use and develop substance use disorders to those prescribed medications that then can transition to recreational drugs. And I think one of the things that we're currently facing is, in Cinnamon, you might be able to speak to this the best, is cannabis, and cannabis being used and purported as a therapeutic, perhaps used recreationally, perhaps having some dependence-like phenomenon. So I'm wondering, how do we balance this sort of therapeutic controlled use of substances, and where do we draw the line of when that becomes problematic? And how does that inform our policy of moving to a place where we can use drugs in a more controlled way or just abstain completely? So I wonder if we could touch a little bit on that sort of balance. You want to start, Cinnamon?
Sure. It's a really important question. I feel like we could probably spend a good chunk of the rest of the morning on that. So want to start in a couple of places. One is that, thinking of putting cannabis as sort of the model or the concept might be really beneficial, right? We know that there are addictive or abuse liability properties to certain forms of cannabis. We've known that for a long time. And we also know that there are clear medicinal properties. The science is growing in terms of what those are, and that we have rigorous studies to support that. Blending those two is really complicated and really important because even if you're using medicinally, you're still holding yourself with some of those risks in place. But our science can really support the idea that specific forms of cannabis, specific potencies, specific doses may tip the scale further towards the risk side, or may tip the scale further toward the more beneficial or therapeutic side, right? So there's data that can support this, and one of the things that's been tricky with cannabis is because of the federal prohibition on cannabis, the research to really push that information forward, push it out to the public, even have solid information on these questions is really has not been able to keep up with the times, right? Science has had very limited ability to contribute to all these policy changes. In the context of the opioid epidemic, I think that's really a crucial piece of the puzzle, right? So during these whole decades of preclinical research, families saying, hey, I think cannabis has something, I think there's something real here, there's some medicinal properties. We had opioids just kind of flooding the market, right? And the idea of this risk-benefit wasn't really being asked. And I have numbers to compare the number of clinical trials that were supported for opioid trials that during the 90s, during the 2000s, before the alarm was really being raised, where cannabis was sort of being pushed aside because it's federally prohibited and there was no path towards research to even tease out these risks and benefits. So we're kind of in a new place where people are seeing this and they're trying to catch up, and cannabis research has been expanded and there's a lot of light behind it now. So we have more and more data coming out to really tease this out when it comes to cannabis. But I think thinking about that balance is something that we should be thinking about with every substance. There really are no side effects, right? Every medicine has its pharmacological effects, and it might be what you intend to use it for is the therapeutic effect, but all the other effects are part of the pharmacology. We just kind of call them side effects because it's not what we intend, or not like the focus of that substance. So yeah, I don't know. I think that it's a complicated question.
Yeah, I wanted to, if I could get some perspective from, thinking about the risk and benefit and how genes and environment could potentially play into those risks and benefits, if anybody wants to comment on, add that kind of perspective.
Yeah, I would love to almost shift the conversation about this a little bit, in the sense that, as Cinnamon was talking about, whether something is classified as having medicinal purposes or it's being used recreationally, that's influenced by a lot of times and policy, and it changes across time. It's very subjective in many ways. And so I think that actually the place that we should start from is, everybody in this room uses drugs. You're hard-pressed to find somebody who doesn't use drugs, whether it is prescription drugs, over-the-counter drugs, or how many folks had a cup of coffee or a tea this morning, right? Every one of us uses drugs, most of us, both for medical reasons and for recreational reasons. In fact, 85% of people in the United States, choose to use alcohol or other drugs recreationally. And so this idea of, okay, why do some people then develop problems, and how do we use that understanding to support public health, help individuals in making the best choices for themselves? So we know that the liability of developing problems with a substance is about 50% genetically influenced. And what that means is about half of the differences between all of us in how much we choose to use alcohol or other drugs and how much we enjoy it, and the likelihood that we'll develop problems, is due to the luck of the draw when it came to the genes that we were born with. And then the other half can be found in differences in our environments, and the types of things Ty was talking about, in families and schools and personal traumas, et cetera. And for every one of us, that combination is going to be different. The way that we conceptualize it, with full credit to my friend and colleague Jane Austin, who's the world's leading psychiatric genetic counselor, they talk about, imagine we all have a mental health jar. So you have that clear glass mason jar in your head. We all have a mental health jar, and when that jar is full, we are actively experiencing problems. So we are experiencing problems with substances or depression or anxiety, whatever that might be. And what are the things that can make that jar full? Our genes and our environments. So we all start life with some marbles in the bottom of that jar, and that's our genetic risk. And some of us are lucky, and we only have a few marbles, which means we have a long way to go before our jar is full. We can experience more, or maybe bigger. It takes bigger environmental traumas or hardships or circumstances to develop problems. And some of us are unlucky, and we're born with jars that are already, 3/4 of the way full, and it doesn't take as much to essentially develop problems. And what each of our jars look like is unique. And we've actually learned a ton about what those marbles are, so how our genes influence risk for addiction, and hopefully we can get into some of that. But just for now and for our purposes, I'll say most of that genetic risk in those marbles isn't specific to any one drug. It's not specific to opiates or cannabis or alcohol. There's some genes that influence the way bodies metabolize drugs that can influence risk, but most of it is related to the way that brains are wired. And that influences why some of us are more likely to develop problems with addiction than others. And we can talk more about what that looks like.
Yeah, I think that's all, and both of the comments are great, and I want to ask a question actually to everybody else here about something. One of the things inherent in the original question was, where's the line between recreational use, for example, normal use, let's call it, and abnormal use or a clinical problem, right? And I think one of the things that happens in psychology and psychiatry is we don't always communicate clearly what the state of the data actually is when it comes to diagnosing something or saying someone actually has a clinical problem. I think the way we present it a lot of times to the general public is that you either have something or you don't, right? So you're depressed or you're not depressed. You have ADHD or you don't have ADHD. But if you look at the data across numerous disorders, it's almost never the case that mental problems, mental disorders are dichotomous, either or things. They look like a bell curve. And so that means symptoms are normally distributed in the general population, which means that if you're at the median or the mean, you might have one or two mild things, right? Or if you're at the 80th percentile, you might have a couple more things. And it's problematic, but not problematic enough to be diagnosable. And so one of the things I was curious about is where do we stand right now on substance use disorders as far as it being a dichotomous kind of thing versus a continuous thing?
Well, I would pick up on that, I guess. I was going to say something about the marbles, which, and maybe this answers the question a little bit, but I think one of the big sets of marbles has to do with stress and trauma, especially early trauma and current stress. And in that way, everybody's jar is sort of filling up. And I think despite a lot of research on what's going on inside our heads and our genes, the incidence of addiction, you know, in the general trend is kind of getting worse and not better. And so I feel like the people who have a substance use disorder are kind of the canaries in the coal mine. They're the ones who are susceptible first, but as was discussed earlier, I think we're all variant in our susceptibility, but no one is immune. And but I also wanted to just pick up on the cannabis thing because I'm genuinely curious about, I know that cannabis plant has many, many different chemicals in it, but I think the recreational use of cannabis is for the THC, Delta 9, Delta 8, Delta 10 probably, and others. And I don't see a lot of medicinal benefit. In healthy people, I'm curious because I find that when I try to look through the literature carefully, it's the harms definitely outweigh benefits that are negligible, and in some cases maybe look to be placebo effects, not really bona fide benefits. And I'm very concerned, especially putting those two things together, that young people who are especially vulnerable to addictions because they learn everything better, and addiction is a kind of learning, they are anxious and stressed and kind of calling out for help in all kinds of ways: mental health, suicide, anxiety, depression, and substance use. And using cannabis makes all those things worse for them. And there's evidence that it's causal, or in many cases causal. It also seems to reduce cognitive functioning and well-being, so reduces IQ. And I think that I'm concerned that market interests, now that, you know, we think cannabis is the solution to everything, are outweighing kind of sober looks at the evidence for THC. Maybe that was off topic, sorry.
Any other perspective on that?
Well, I want to add one piece. There's so much there, and I'm happy to follow up on pieces that I missed. But I think that we've talked about this balance of genes and environment. A very crucial aspect of environment is public policy, right? Legalization, what drugs are legal, and that promotes a perception of safety or recreational, at least acceptability of recreational use. And so policy has changed a lot when it comes to cannabis. And I do think that there are known risks with that. Potencies have increased, the perception of safe use has increased. We know absolutely starting any use of any substance at a young age is just sort of adding to that jar in synergistic ways. And so by legalizing in a way that's been kind of the Wild West, I do think there's a lot of problematic features to that. Colorado has legalized cannabis from 21 and older. We know brains develop all the way up to age 25. I think the evidence would say starting use of cannabis at age 25, using moderately, thinking carefully about dose and potency has very limited risks, right? But that's not necessarily how it's framed or how the current use patterns tend to unfold. And so these nuances and details really matter in terms of this question of risks versus benefits. in terms of, so I just want to highlight the piece of how policy is important. Canada legalized federally at age 18 and older, and so that's an even younger age, when we know brains are actively developing and learning, and I think that's a real downside. There's options to legalize but reduce the potency of the forms of cannabis that are available. I think the limitations on research have really sort of hamstrung researchers to contribute to these conversations and say, hey, we really know there are these causal risks, but I think we're at the point where we probably should have started at a safer position, a more conservative position, and not sort of open the door up to products that have 90 or 95% THC available now on our legal market.
Can I just interject really quickly? I just want to say, laws do not stop young people like me. I mean, things were illegal, and they were also not potent, and I smoked weed every day.
But you didn't smoke 90% THC concentrates.
I didn't, but I ended up homeless and using dirty needles and getting thrown out of 3 schools. So I'm not blaming a specific thing, but I'm saying that just because it's illegal doesn't mean we're going to go, oh, okay.
And I'm not suggesting making
wait,
it illegal,
yeah.
but I think the way in which we structure our policy absolutely matters in terms of access and perception to risky forms, and whether or not that's a black market, which can actually be, like if you have complete prohibition, black market is actually going to be more risky, right?
Oh, yeah.
So
but I would
please
also
take my comments to understand that
and I'm
there's
just trying
yeah.
to, I thought we weren't supposed to always agree. But and I also think Danielle would say that the people like me are the ones who won't listen to the laws, are the ones who are most at risk in some ways, right?
Yeah, so what I wanted to add is that, so we know there's gene-environment interaction, and so we talked about you can be genetically at risk, but no one's destined to develop problems, and so what are the ways that the environment either exacerbates or reduces risk? And Judith was talking about stress, trauma. We know that those are things that exacerbate genetic risk. They also can be sufficient in some individuals on their own, right? You can have traumas that can be sufficient to lead individuals who otherwise might not have used to use. But with respect to this idea of what environments are key, what we have found repeatedly in the literature is that environments that increase the likelihood that people will use and that people who are carrying genetic risk are more likely to develop problems are environments that increase access and acceptance. Any environments that increase access and acceptance increase the likelihood that people who are at risk will develop problems. And those could be things found in the home. So it could be how much access young people have to alcohol, could be policies that increase access. And yes, we very much worry about the cannabis piece of things because legalization has definitely increased access and it's increased acceptance as well of use. It can be things found in how many alcohol outlets are there, or how many friends does an individual have that provides access and acceptance. So it can be lots of types of environments, but those tend to be the 2 key things that how much spouses, on the other hand, I know this is Ty's area, tend to spouses who are not also risky users tend to actually decrease the likelihood that someone who is at risk will develop problems, which for any of us who've been married know that, having someone who is monitoring your behavior is a way of potentially decreasing access and acceptance. So those tend to be 2 key things of which there can be multiple environmental levers to pull.
And I'll just circling back, the opioid epidemic is a key example of how unfettered or unconstrained medical access really increased and increased the exposure to folks who may have abuse liability or more vulnerability toward that to sort of meeting up with this very highly addictive substance.
So when I was young, Nancy Reagan was saying, just say no. And I'm almost, I do think I have a genetic propensity for this, but my husband would say that if he wants me to not do something, he tells me to do it, and vice versa. So some of us are, if she had said just try it, I probably would have said, don't tell me what to do.
And maybe, Ryan, if you'll allow me, this would be an okay time to, I just want to quickly mention what I talked about earlier about how our genes, so we can talk about there's genetic risk, but what does that really mean? How do our genes? So we talked a little bit about there are some genes that influence the way bodies respond to a drug. That's why some people try opiates and feel nauseous and are like, how do people get addicted to this? And other people are like, wow, this feels great. But the majority of when we're talking about genetic risk, I hate the word for, genetic risk associated with substance use problems, it's related to the way brains are wired. And we know there's kind of two overarching pathways. And one is related to the way that brains process risk and reward. And some people, and this is, as Ty was saying, all distributed like a bell curve. And it's not necessarily a bad thing either. Some people have brains that are highly attuned to reward. You know, this is what shows up in the media as people who like their dopamine hits, right? They're risk takers. They love trying new things. They're excited about what's right in front of them. They don't immediately have brains that stop and go, oh, is this a good idea if I go out with all of my friends tonight when I have a big exam tomorrow and I really want to go into med school, so I should probably think about that's a lot of thought process, right? Some people are better naturally at that than others. Other people are more the risk takers. And by the way, CEOs, entrepreneurs, fighter pilots, they are also higher on this as well too. So this is not just risk for substance use problems. And the other pathway is related to the way brains process anxiety and fear. And so we know that, you know, some of us are more prone to worry and to rumination. And when you then have traumas and other kinds of things, then if there are not good supportive processes in place, then individuals might turn to drugs as a way to cope. And so I think understanding that these are some of the ways that our genes influence risk, we can also then think about how, knowing that, we can do better at treatment and holistic recovery, but we can also think about preventing problems and supporting kids who are more at risk, who have some of these characteristics. How do you channel them into outlets so that they can be the best version of themselves, right? They can be the neuroscience superstars, and or they can be the, you know, rock climbers, or the, you know, the folks who are doing all of those risky high adrenaline sports. How do they channel it into that, as opposed to potentially finding risks and the sensations that substances provide?
I think that's such a valuable, you know, insight, 'cause it's like, well, how does it go from genes to, you know, the actual behavior, in this case, substance abuse? And there's a term from a researcher, Sandra Scar, I love, called genes are evocative. And so it's not just you got genes, you got environment, right? But you have things like novelty seeking or impulsivity. Someone's not passive about that. They will actually then craft an environment that optimizes for that trait, right? So if you're a novelty seeker, an impulsive person, there's a whole series of bad decisions, okay, that led up to the point that you use substances in a way that was destructive. And if you're sitting there with a client, you can then just backtrack and say, so who are you hanging out with? That's where I always start. And it usually wasn't the people they should have been hanging out with. Where did you go? Well, it wasn't the place they were supposed to be, you know? How late were you out and what were you doing? Once again, not great, right? And if you ask the person, though, how did you end up in jail with a blood alcohol content of whatever, they'll say, you know, next thing I knew. Next thing I knew. Well, maybe not, you know? So, yeah, these underlying dispositions, they're not passive. They're actually active in crafting these environments people are in.
I wonder if we could touch a little bit on, speaking of genetic risk and the environments that can be conducive or not. I mean, if an individual knows they have a genetic risk, and how do we enable them to handle that information without it feeling like it's they're sentenced to develop this versus redirecting those passions? And what are some strategies that we could use to help direct them in the positive direction, as opposed to making them feel like they're destined for this addiction and being more of a drawback to their lifestyle?
So you've actually been doing a lot of research on this, because obviously we want to use this information for good. We want to use it to develop more effective prevention, intervention. And one of the things that always gets brought up is, okay, are people then going to think of it as determinative? Oh my gosh, there's nothing I can do about it. Then I'm destined to develop problems, which is the exact opposite of what we want this information to be, which is empowering. And so we've actually studied this. How do people respond to, how do you deliver this information in ways that are empowering and inspire change and active behavior change? There's whole fields of this. And basically what we find is that and that's not just us. Several groups have shown this now. People get it when you talk about complex genetic and environmental influences, meaning with just a little bit of psychoeducation. I mean, we've just been talking for the last little bit here, and about how it's not one gene, it's many genes, and they each just have a tiny role on their own, and they're not determinative. And the environment also plays a role. You provide some basic psychoeducation, and it corrects those kind of deterministic ideas. The other idea is like, oh, well, if you tell people they're at lower risk, are they going to run off and think like, woohoo, I can do whatever I want now? And we don't find any evidence that that's the case. And we have started actually providing people with personalized risk profiles, and where we're integrating these newest advances in genomics along with what are the early behaviors and the environments that we know put people at risk, to sort of, so you can understand, here are some of the characteristics that you carry, here's some of the risk factors, here is now what you can do about it. Here are the evidence-based practices for how do you channel that risk-taking, impulsive, disposition. It's not a bad thing. It can lead to problems. How do you channel it in other ways? And here's resources and opportunities so that instead of seeking out the bars, you might seek out other places where you get the things you're looking for. Interactions with young people, people your age, an outlet for that exciting, sensation-seeking kind of tendencies, but maybe in ways that substances aren't central to that. If you are somebody who's more anxiety-prone, how do we put in place coping strategies around that individual so they're not turning to substances later? And so I think that we can use this information. And what we're finding is that people are highly satisfied, even with now we're giving specific genomic risk scores. We can create these now. Happy to talk more about that if folks are interested. People over 80% of people say it's useful, it's going to help me in making decisions. Less than 2% of people have said, I'm sorry I found out, or I regretted it. We have genetic counselors on call to make sure they understand it, et cetera. People understand it, they like it. So I think a lot of these hard questions about, oh my gosh, what is it going to mean when we're telling people about their risk, are great questions to ask. But as we've started studying them, we find that we can give this information in ways that are empowering when we do it thoughtfully.
Judy, did you have something
Yeah,
there?
I kind of heard you say in a way that what we could do is, rather than the personal scores, we could do the personal scores, but we could also just recognize that this is so prevalent in society. About 1 in 3 of us in the US will develop a substance use disorder in our lifetime. And maybe what we need are more effective ways to help us cope with our suffering and our stress and anxiety through connecting with other people, having sensitive teachers and therapists and community members, and more healthy ways for young people to take risks. I think we know that's true. So some of us are really inclined to risk-taking, and I grew up in suburban New Jersey. There was really nothing to do, but when I found a little weed, I thought this is much better. But I think kids need not to be told, color in the lines here, be good, be careful, you're at risk. I think they need here, do some really outrageous music or rock climbing or mountain biking. It shouldn't all be athletic, by the way, because not everybody's going that direction, but they need a way to explore the edges of their own consciousness and their own lives that's hopeful and risky and challenging, and that they might fail and that they have support for, instead of, the mundane, look forward to your next exam kind of thing.
I couldn't agree more with that idea of allowing kids to make some bad decisions within reason, and especially in the current culture we have right now. And I also just wanted to say that as an anecdotal example of the psychoeducation, when I was a freshman here, I took a biological psychology class just a few steps away. And one of the ways you teach how the brain works is you teach what happens if it's not working properly. And so you have these units on drugs, and they'll say, hey, this is how it compromises your brain functioning. And they were talking about cocaine. And they were going through the neurobiology of how cocaine works and the kinds of effects it had, the euphoria and so forth. And I sat there and I thought to myself, I would love cocaine. You know, I would really, really enjoy that experience.
You would.
Yeah. And I thought to myself right then and there, I don't have like some moral opposition to it or whatever, but I just thought that's not for me. You know, I can't touch that. And you know, so I didn't. But me being a little obsessive about things, then I was like, so then what else, Ty, can you not touch? And it went all kinds of broad directions, you know. So I haven't had a TV my entire life because I'm like, I cannot control myself. You know, I can't have nice things like that. So that's a little bit of an unusual maybe circumstance, but yes, I think, you know, providing some freedom in the environment for kids to use their free will, providing psychoeducation about, hey, here's the architecture of how this thing works, can be hugely beneficial.
I wonder if we could switch gears just a little bit and talk a little bit more about, Danielle, you had mentioned about how the genes influence brain networks and brain connectivity and how that can alter behaviors. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about some of those brain aspects and how the brain can influence not only the initial experience of a drug, but also how your brain then might be more prone to potentially developing a habitual pattern of drug use that then turns into a substance use disorder. So does anyone want to tackle some of the brain changes that might emerge?
Can I start and be quick, and then we'll hand over to the experts? I think
you are one of the experts.
Well, really, the part of this, maybe I am, yeah, okay. I think we are really sensitive, some of us, to pleasure and reward, really tuned into that, which is a way that we're saying we're really seeking meaning. We're kind of out on the edge. Some people are naturally more content, and some people are maybe never really content. And that's partly inherited. I think we're also, sometimes people who are at risk are insensitive to punishments. So sometimes, you know, you say to someone, you might get in trouble, and I would say, like, yeah, but what's your point, you know? That's not a big deal for me. Also, the risk associated with ADHD, depression, and anxiety are partly genetic and inform propensity to seeking, you know, self-medication, basically, relief. So impulsivity is another one. So obviously Ty was not impulsive. If I had learned about the cocaine in the classroom, which I had learned years earlier, that would have been a license to go get some. So I think those are examples, and those are circuits to do with, as was said earlier, responding to anxiety and sensitivity to stress, but also sensitivity to reward. So we vary in that, like a distribution. Some people are just sort of starved for meaning. Not because there's not meaning out there, it's because we're kind of insensitive to it, and so we're trying to generate it however we can. And science is a good alternative, I'll say.
And I'll just add, I think Judith did a great job of explaining these, you know, different underlying circuits that contribute to risk. And I think it's important to point out that there's good evolutionary reason why our brains work this way and why we have variability on it. I mean, because you figure we are now operating in a present time and world for which our brains were not designed. Our brains evolved for its world hundreds of thousands of years ago. And then, you know, if you think of impulsivity or, you know, seeking reward, if you will, what are the things that produce reward in our brain? Well, we had to have a way for our brains to respond to food, sex, things that perpetuate the human race, right? And so then you think, okay, well, what do other things can activate those same circuits? And drugs, it turns out, do that really well. They're activating those reward circuits. And the fact that we vary in our impulsivity across the population. You know, somebody had to go out and be out hunting the lions, but you didn't want everybody to be doing that, because some folks had to make sure that somebody is going to survive, right? And so our evolution primed us to have these distributions of people with different traits. A little bit of anxiety can be really great in some circumstances. You needed the people who weren't like, oh, lion, I wonder what this furry thing does, right? So all our brains evolved with these circuits that had purposes, and it was good to have a lot of variability in it. And drugs essentially are activating those circuits that exist for other reasons. And the thing with addiction is that drugs produce very potent rewards. So they activate the reward system, and then they change that system such that the brain is like, oh, you know, things that otherwise were previously naturally rewarding, spending time with colleagues, with friends, with your spouse, well, that doesn't produce, I mean, I love my husband, but he can't be counted on to be 100% highly rewarding all the time. A drug, on the other hand, can be highly rewarding. And when your brain is used to, well, I can have that, why would you want to risk it to have all these other kinds of rewards? And so to Judith's point, like thinking about how do we actually provide those experiences? I 100% agree that as a society, we can benefit from general public health, how do we put in place supports, processes, et cetera, from kids from an early age, all throughout the lifespan, to essentially work with what we know are these brain circuits that drugs, in a way, just take advantage of and have the potential to hijack.
I'd like to switch a little bit to some of the audience questions, if we could. And one of them sort of ties into the line of thinking that I was going to approach next. And that is, how do you think we can overcome addiction? This is a student question. Is it replacing with something else? And I guess one of the things that I'm curious about is how can we use someone's genetic predispositions as potential tool to actually allow them to recover? We've talked a lot about risk and the kind of the beginning stages, but how do we then treat? And so how could we use, strategies to overcome addiction and potentially even use their genetic makeup to help understand that better?
I would say, I'm waiting for other people, but the real low-hanging fruit, I think, where we should focus is on young people. Most addictions develop in young people, again, because they learn everything better, quicker, faster, easier. And addiction is a form of learning. So I think if we put way more resources into supporting brain development, healthy, psychological, spiritual, intellectual, physical development of young people, we would see a reduction, and they need that support. So that's one thing. I don't think the answer is going to be in our heads. When I went to grad school at the University of Colorado, I came here after treatment and all other things. I came here with the intention of solving addiction so I could find out what was wrong with my brain, so I could flip the switch and use with impunity. I don't think that is the way it goes. I think it is a contextual thing. There is a lot that society can do, as other people have said.
I think that speaks to prevention being really, if we're really talking about solving, it is a question of prevention, right? Because once the learning and the trajectory takes place, it's fundamentally, those changes are there permanently, right? You can recover, receptors can adapt back, but the brain is fundamentally changed. And to the point of kind of the drugs hijacking these systems, it's like they get hijacked, and then the dosing, the frequency, all of that gets up. So it's just like this cycle that continues. So I think if we're really talking about eradicating these patterns. It's fully prevention. But I do think there's some ways in which the conversation is evolving, and thematically from this panel as well. Thinking about this as a continuum, right, is very helpful in people seeking support early. Thinking about, hey, you've got one symptom or you've got a couple of behaviors that are trending towards these more problematic patterns. Let's take a look at this. Let's talk about it. Let's have the conversation. Let's provide the psychoeducation before you've really gotten to that far end of the continuum where it really becomes much more challenging, and there's been a lot of damage to personal and professional relationships. So I really like that. I think honest psychoeducation, talking about things beyond just say no, right? Nancy Reagan's out. It's like we have information. The folks up here are doing their best to disseminate that in ways that's digestible and honest, but really building these conversations early and with authentic data behind them.
I agree with everything that's been said. I think there's a couple specific ways that, in particular, those of us who are working solidly in the genetics of addiction think about these advances changing things for the better in the future. One of them is that we really have, over just the last 5 years, made radical advances in gene identification. So consider that no field has evolved as rapidly as computer science. So think about how much our world has changed over the last few decades from I have a clip that I show and I give talks sometimes on the Today Show from the mid-90s where they're talking about, what is the internet? It's something that scientists are talking about. Like, do you use it like mail? Do you write to it? Like, what is the internet? I mean, 30 years later, we have a world that's been radically changed. Consider that the only field, and that was made possible by exponential growth, which these brains that evolved hundreds of thousands of years ago just can't even wrap their head around. The only field that's advancing now faster than computer science has advanced over the last few decades is genetics. So our technology is advancing more rapidly than computer science did. It just started about 30 years later. So right now, genetics is something that scientists are kind of talking about, right? All these advances, and we can create risk scores for thousands of medical conditions. But I don't want to understate that I think this actually is coming quickly to our lives and our everyday lives in ways that we can't even fathom right now. So we've identified, like I lead a large international gene identification consortium. In our current analysis, we have 4 million individuals. And really what we're doing is comparing the genomes of individuals who are affected with substance use disorder or who are higher on a trait, as Ty was talking about, with those who are unaffected or who are low on a trait. And we literally step through the millions of locations in our genome to identify all of these places, thousands of them now, that just increase or decrease risk a little bit. And we can now add them all up to create genetic risk scores for individuals, and they account for about 15% of the variation, which is bigger than any other single factor, even things like trauma or poverty or other things that we know play really important roles. Genetics now, we can measure it. And I do think that, so there's a few things that we can do now. Now that we've identified these thousands of genetic variants, which are just going to continue to grow, what we're actually doing is we're looking at, it can help us understand the biology, and we can do drug repurposing. So we use AI technologies, we look at drugs that are out there, what circuits do they work on, how do those relate to the circuits that we're finding that the genes that are involved in addiction are influencing. And so I think it's going to have important effects on pharmaceutical development. I realize that's not the end all be all, but right now we have 4 FDA approved medications to treat substance use disorder. Compare that to cardiovascular disease, where there's over 200 medications. This is a crisis for which we need better treatments, and I think that we will deliver on that in the next decade. I'm focusing on that piece because we talked a lot about the prevention, which I agree is critical, and most of my work's actually in that area. But I think it can help both with better treatments and better drug development. But the other piece is that if we go back to what have we learned about what are these genes doing, they're influencing the way our brains are wired. They are not genes for substance use disorder. They are genes that are influencing impulsivity, let's just call it. It shows up in little kids as more approach, right? More sociability. It shows up as ADHD and conduct problems. It then shows up in adolescence with risky substance use, more likely to develop problems. But it also influences a whole host of other life outcomes. So when we look in our big electronic health record biobanks and we say, what do people who are carrying this elevated genetic risk, which, the lay media might say for substance use disorder is associated with, it's not just substance use problems. It's elevated rates of cardiovascular diseases, liver cancers, lung cancers, HIV infection. It's how much we drink, smoke, obesity, eat, have risky sex. So now if you think about, okay, so this is how our genes are influencing risk. We can use it on the prevention side, right? Right now, pediatricians, they treat ADHD. They aren't talking to parents about, and you also need to realize that this disposition can show up in risk in all these other ways. We need to put in place those holistic supports and programs that Judith was talking about. On the recovery side, we treat opioid use disorder, or what's your drug of choice? Alcohol use disorder, cocaine. But if we just treat that, it's going to pop up as compulsive gambling, compulsive eating. We can use what we know about what kind of risk people carry to develop more holistic plans for not just recovery from that substance, but for how to promote human health. And so I think those are things that are going to be coming, and I hope will change within all of our lifetimes. And that's ways that I think understanding of genetics specifically can make a difference in changing the narrative.
Judy, do you have something?
Yeah, we talked on the bus on the way over here, and I said I'm skeptical. And Danielle just said, a decade or so, you think there's going to be big changes. And I don't see it that way because of the complexity of the genetics, because of the increase in access and the increase in angst. Basically, I would say are those the two big things. And I feel like, the best treatment that's coming on board now is the GLP-1 agonists, the things like Wegovy. And I don't know if that was pointed to by any genetic panel or not. I think it was kind of a surprise. And what it does is it reduces hunger. And if we're saying that some of us are especially prone to seeking meaning, and that was evolutionarily a benefit to society to have some people out there petting the lions. We can sedate us, I'm overstating it maybe a little bit, so that we're not so prone to that. But is that what society needs, or does it need more recognition? I love the science. I think it's really valuable to understand how complicated it is. For me, that science has pointed to changes in recognizing how difficult it is to be a human being alive, and what kind of support I need to not pick up a drug or a drink today to cope with that.
And Judith, so I would say yes, and we can use genetics in these other ways. And I love that you brought up the GLP-1 receptors. And I think they are a beautiful example of how basic science can really make a difference. And I want to mention, I don't think that we're going to have all new drugs in a decade. I think that we will be in a better place a decade from now. I think that within all of, I have a son who's 18 and a daughter who's 9. I think within my kids' lifetime, we will all have access to our full sequenced genomes, and we will know what we are at risk for in terms of thousands of medical conditions. And I think that is coming because it's coming whether we want it or not. It's being driven by private industry. Private industry is, right now, genetic testing is an $18 billion industry. It's expected to double by the end of this decade. I have multiple companies reaching out to me repeatedly about looking for risk for addiction, how to incorporate this. So I've gotten involved in some of these efforts, not because I wanted to or thought I would ever, but because I realized we actually need scientists around this table, or else it's going to be driven purely by corporations who see dollar signs. You used to be able to get access, you could download your raw genotypic data from 23andMe or Ancestry.com, and you could upload it to this free public site, and you could get more than your genetic risk scores for more than 1,500 medical conditions. Alcohol use disorder was the third most requested genetic risk score. That was the only substance use disorder. It was the third most requested. Psychiatric and substance use disorders.
So
made up
more
half
than
of the top 10.
5% of the people who die today die of alcohol use disorder. So we
Yes.
know this, we're all getting our genomes done, we got our risk thing. What really matters is not how many companies are buying in, but how many dead people there are.
I
you know?
100% agree. And here's why I think it's important, though. I think industry's going to drive it because they're interested. The technology is coming. It's coming fast. We saw that happen in computer science. I think what our job is to also bring back in all of the complex perspectives we've talked about today. That it is not just genes, it's genes in the environment. We need to do all the things that you've been talking about. But like when it comes to GLP-1 receptors, I think, and the preliminary, I do think that they will be extremely promising. And it appears that they reduce this kind of, people talk about the noise in their head surrounding food, surrounding substances, that it just kind of reduces that constant thought of craving. And so I think it's operating on this general disposition toward, what I want. I'm thinking about it a lot. And I do think it's an example of how a drug might be able to help. We're not trying to reduce impulsivity or get rid of it, but to be able to quiet some of those parts that are leading to problems and potentially, intervene in the crisis that is addiction and all these lives that are being lost. I do think there's potential there. I don't think it means we shouldn't do
discovered by
all those
accident,
things.
though, not for addiction, right? So,
By accident, yes. And I started there and then went on my tangent about genetic testing. But it was, I had dinner with the man who discovered the GLP-1 receptor. He did it by he was studying lizards. And by the way, the lizard is still in his freezer to this day, he told me. So it's a great example of how basic science, you fast forward a few decades, it can potentially, I think GLP-1 receptors on obesity and diabetes minimally are going to be one of the hugest health impacts of our time. I think others are going to come, but it does show how basic science can really make a difference, I think, in health outcomes.
Can you bring the lizard back to life?
I think he's real dead.
We have just a few minutes left in the panel. I wonder if we could close by just a 30-second snapshot of what kind of gives you the most hope, I guess, for the field, the science behind studying substance use disorder, and in particular, the neuroscience and genetics.
I think it's really hopeful that we're no longer blaming people for individual variation in risk, or susceptibility to a mental disorder. I think hopefully the science, the basic science, will lead to more understanding and more compassion and more opportunity.
There's been amazing progress. I've learned a lot today sitting up here, and I'm like, wow. I learned a lot. There's been a lot of advances I didn't know about that are really encouraging. 15% is an incredible number for any disorder. And I also love just the conversation up here and the complexity of different ways that we understand substance abuse, and also the complexity of ways then that we're saying it's just not this easy thing to treat it. I think that is a different mentality now compared to a decade, 2 decades ago. And of course, that's the way things need to move forward.
I agree with Judith. I'm most excited about the fact that we're talking about it and that we're changing the narrative. And I think that that is the first step in, simultaneously, all of us scientists are over here working on the science piece of things, but the fact that people are interested and they care, and we're starting to realize, and treat addictions as the disorders that they are and the medical conditions that they are, and move away from blaming people, et cetera, I hope will then create the space for us to be able to use that science for the prevention and treatment and recovery pieces.
Yeah, I echo that. I think it's rooms like this. It's the sophisticated questions you all are asking. It says to me that the science and the details and the complexity is getting out there and engaging with experts or the ivory tower, but disseminating and talking about these things. It's conversations with my 2 teenagers who seem to have much more nuanced understanding and their friends, right? It's not just because they have a mom who does this. They know they're having these conversations early. They're elementary school, they're middle school. They're talking about it in a way that's authentic and meaningful and accurate to the data. And so that's what gives me hope for sure.
Well, thank you. I think that brings us to a close at 10:10. So thank you all for your perspectives and sharing. If you could all help me thank them for sharing their perspectives.